Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Matteo Cagliero. I'm a sophomore studying computer science at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park side and JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Harvard College undergraduate Landon Elks.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Landon Elks, and I'm a sophomore at Harvard College studying economics and history, and I'm a member of the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum Student Committee. This evening, we're here to engage in a crucial conversation about the future of education, both in America and around the world. The state of our schools has reached really an inflection point, particularly with the potential elimination of the Department of Education under President Trump. We'll discuss the implications of this shift under Secretary Nominee Linda McMahon, while also touching on how education policy has become increasingly politicized and how all of this impacts students. I'm truly honored now to introduce our esteemed panel for this discussion, beginning with Thomas Kane, who's the Walter H. Gale Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and Faculty Director of the Center of Education Policy Research. Next, we have Aaliyah Samuel, who's the President and CEO of the Collaborative for Social Emotional Learning, as well as former Deputy Assistant Director for Local, State, and National Engagement at the U.S. Department of Education. We also have Martin West, who's the Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and Faculty Research Fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Finally, the discussion this evening will be moderated by Tassie Warren, the Co-Executive Director and Chief Strategy Officer of the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University. Now, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel of speakers to the stage.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you for that. Welcome. So I am really excited for this conversation. I have lots of questions, but I'm also going to make sure that we save time to take questions from all of you so you can start thinking about those. So there's a lot going on in Washington right now. Much of it, not all of it, having to do with education. So I am thrilled to have this group of experts to help us kind of understand what's actually happening and what that means for students, because I think that's what's most important. So to ground us and get us started, I'm going to turn to Tom to help us understand how students are actually doing right now. So Tom, you, along with colleagues at Stanford and Dartmouth, have created something called the Education Recovery Scorecard, which you should explain, but to really give a fuller picture of academic performance, leveraging kind of district, state, and national data so that we can really understand at a more granular level how students are doing, particularly post-pandemic. So you recently released a report. Tell us what the headlines are. How are students doing?
So at a very high level, students are about half a grade equivalent behind in math and in reading. But underneath that, there are at least three really important facts that we saw. Number one is that the losses were much larger in higher poverty school districts than in the wealthier school districts. Losses. So I'm not saying, students are student achievement is lower in Lynn and Fall River and Everett than in Newton and Lexington. It is, and it always has been for a long time here in Massachusetts. It's just that those gaps are wider now than before the pandemic, not just in Massachusetts, but in virtually every state around the country. The second thing, though, is that even among the high poverty districts, there's been a lot of variation in just the magnitude of the loss. So, for instance, here in Massachusetts, I'd love to ask people if they knew this, but Lynn, Massachusetts, is 2 grade equivalents behind where they their counterparts were in 2019. Fall River, Everett, similar. You'd be hard-pressed to find any mention of that in the Massachusetts Department of Education website, emphasizing just the magnitude of the losses by different districts. But not every high-poverty district saw a loss that large. So, for instance, Los Angeles Unified School District, Compton, just outside Los Angeles in California, Birmingham, Alabama, are examples of districts that are back to where they were in 2019 or close to it in both math and reading. So even though the average high poverty district has lost a lot of ground, there's a tremendous amount of variation. And the third point that I wanted to make is that what we're seeing is not just a result of what happened or didn't happen during the 2021 school year. What we're seeing is partially a continuation of things that had started happening before the pandemic, especially in reading. Reading achievement had been declining since about 2015 or so, and especially at the bottom end. And so we saw from 22 to 24, students continued to lose ground. But that wasn't just because of recovery activities. Presumably it was just a continuation of what was happening before. But a second way in which what we're seeing now is not just the result of what happened or didn't happen during 2021 is that absenteeism has risen substantially. So if the pandemic was the earthquake, absenteeism is the tsunami that is continuing to run through schools. It's happened after, maybe potentially as a result of the pandemic, but that is the current struggle. It'll be very hard to get students to catch up without solving the absenteeism challenge.
I want to pick up on that later, but Aaliyah, I'm going to turn to you next. So in your introduction, we heard that you currently run an organization called the Collaborative on Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning.
Yes.
Can you talk to us about what social emotional learning is? What does that mean?
Yeah.
And I would encourage you also to sort of round out the picture of beyond the sort of academic scores, how are students doing right now?
So good evening. I want to answer this question in two ways. I'm going to give you the research side first, and then also just very pragmatically speaking, what does it look like? I cut my teeth in education, hard to believe, 25 years ago as a special ed teacher and went on to become an assistant principal. So when I think about the work that we're doing right now, I think about it through those lenses of kind of really what happens in a classroom or school environment on a day-to-day basis, and then what those of us who have matriculated through school talk about school, how we're also talking about this experience right now. So why academic is so important is CASEL is actually the organization that coined the phrase social emotional learning 30 years ago. We just celebrated our 30th anniversary. There have been several meta-analyses with millions of students across the world that look at the positive outcomes of really coupling academics and social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is how we interact with others. It's how we approach problems. It's how we make decisions. It's our awareness of self and others. And the importance of not trying to bifurcate those two things, because we're talking about educating a whole individual. And so over the last 30 years, CASEL has been very focused, number one, on what is the research and evidence-based around social emotional learning and academic outcomes. Two, what are the policy conditions that have to be in place in order to implement social emotional learning, whether it be at the classroom level, the district level, and or the state level? And then what are those high quality practices and what does it look like in implementation? So research, policy, and practice are our three big veins of work. So on a pragmatic level, what does it look like in the classroom? What is this thing called SEL? Because if you Google a headline right now, you could hear a whole myriad of things of what SEL is. I can tell you 90% of it is what it is not. So just want to just name that right out the gate and be very intentional. Part of the reason why I'm here, and I actually travel more than I think I want to, is to be able to address the misinformation around what is SEL and, which has no place in schools. Well, to be the person that I am, I want to give you a couple of concrete examples. Today, by pure coincidence, my hotel is hosting about 300 high schoolers from across Massachusetts for the DECA convention. So these are high schoolers that are being prepared for the business entrepreneurial world. And as I'm talking to these kids, I'm like, how do you experience this program? What are you learning? And they said, I'm learning skills like collaboration, how to communicate effectively, how to be able to take feedback. Those are SEL skills. I actually want to read just a little bit about the blurb because I had to go back and research exactly what DECA is. And it said, aligned with the 21st century skills in the areas of critical thinking, problem solving, communication, collaboration, creativity, and innovation, DECA's emerging leader, yada, 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 yada. Those are all SEL skills that, when incorporated into a classroom effectively, actually help young people learn. Want to give you another very pragmatic example. Who has math anxiety or has had math anxiety? Okay, myself as well. Algebra made me nervous. Geometry made me nervous. Doctoral program, statistics. I was like, why am I having to do this? Kids who end up being successful in math or any subject area have a sense of self-awareness to be able to say, wait a minute, I'm feeling anxious about this. Then be able to have help-seeking behaviors to be able to say, hey, I'm really struggling with this. I need to be able to ask my teacher for help, my peer for help, my parents for help. And those are the types of skills that we talk about are social-emotional learning skills. Why it has a place in the classroom is because you can't bifurcate learning and academics and social emotional learning skills. They're not either or. It's not, do I need to spend more time on this or the other, but they're actually really integrated well. Well, should be integrated well. And when they are, we see higher student academic performance. We see better life skills, more responsible decision-making, and the list goes on and on. And again, their meta-analysis going back to 2011 showcasing the importance of these skills. I also want to give you another really pragmatic example of SEL skills at play. So I'll date myself. I have a soon-to-be driver. And so we've been teaching our son how to drive, but so have the parents around us. So when you go to a high school parking lot on a Saturday or Sunday morning, you'll see parents with these scared kids behind the wheel trying to learn how to drive. And really, not only are we trying to teach them the skills of seatbelt on, right, left, clicker, watching the speed limit, but it's also making responsible decisions in that process of critically examining the impacts of the decision you make. Do I text or not? Do I speed or not? Do I talk to my friend or not? But these are skills that are also taught in various settings. So when we say SEL skills or social emotional learning isn't just important for academic skills, this is how it also plays out just in day-to-day life and why it's so important to have. Also, being the book nerd that I am, I was reading this book on AI, this article on AI and technology on the flight here today, and it talked about the #1 skill for the future is reasoning. That's critical examination. And that is a skill that is not only taught through SEL, but most commonly practiced in school and classroom settings. So that's why social emotional learning plays such a critical role in the school building. And not just even in the school building, outside of the school building.
Well, as someone else who has a child who needs to learn how to drive, that really resonates. I can deeply appreciate that. Okay, so Marty, I'm going to turn to you. This is the Institute of Politics. So can you speak a little to sort of there's a lot of discussion about the Department of Education and whether or not it's going to continue to exist. I don't think that's a new discussion. So I'd welcome you to kind of share a little bit about kind of some of the history, but kind of what happens at the Department of Education actually? What are the decisions that are made, and what would happen if it were eliminated?
Yeah, so a lot of people don't know that we haven't had a Department of Education forever. It's actually one of our newest federal agencies. It was created under President Carter. It opened its doors in 1980. And immediately upon its creation, it was under assault. Ronald Reagan won the 1980 election and came into office committed to abolishing the Department of Education. Carter made the case for the department by arguing that really there were a lot of different education-related activities scattered across the federal bureaucracy. Some of them were in what was then called the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, but others were in other parts of the federal government. And the idea was that it would be make sense to rationalize things, to bring it together, make it more coordinated, raise its profile by having a cabinet-level official at the helm. And so that was the case that was made. President Reagan and conservatives in general saw it as, to some degree, symbolizing federal involvement in an area of policymaking that some of them thought the federal government shouldn't be involved in at all, right? They say education isn't mentioned anywhere in the Constitution, and so there's no legitimate role for the federal government to play. But over time, again, even prior to the creation of the department, members of Congress had come to understand this as one of the areas where they could exercise Congress's spending authority under the spending clause to provide for the general welfare of the Republic. And so an accumulation of education activities had developed, and so that's what was brought together in the department. The important thing to note, though, is that there was no major sort of inflection point in federal policy at the time the department was created. I say when I'm teaching on this, the creation of the department is more of a footnote than an inflection point when you're telling the story of federal policy in American education. So what is it that the department does now? Well, it's an executive branch agency charged with implementing the laws that are passed by Congress. So to some extent, it depends on what the laws do. The main things that they do is, first of all, provide funding, and I'll focus here on K-12 education. The two largest federal funding streams are Title I, which goes to districts to support the education of economically disadvantaged students, and then IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, supports the education of students with disabilities. So those are the two largest federal funding streams. Together, though, all federal funding for K-12 education only accounts for 8 to 10% of total spending on K-12 education in a typical year. So it's not a major player. But, okay, allocating funding is the first. A second is then setting rules through regulations on how those funds can be used, and then in some cases, what other conditions need to be in place in order for a state to accept those funds. And here, the clearest example are the requirements that states have test-based accountability systems in place in order to accept their Title I dollars. So this started with the No Child Left Behind Act in 2001. It was carried forward in a somewhat modified version under the current Every Student Succeeds Act. But states have to test students annually in math and reading in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school. They have to disseminate the results of those tests, and then they need to take action to improve persistently low-performing schools. Those are federal requirements that come as a condition of receiving Title I funds. So there's the funds, there's the rules attached to the funds, and then a third area of the department's responsibility is protecting students' civil rights. So enforcing the protections of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, that no one can be denied an educational benefit on the basis of their race, ethnicity, or national origin. You have Title IX protections with respect to gender, and a range of civil rights protections, and those are carried out by the Office for Civil Rights. And then the final area of federal policy, major area, is supporting research and development activities and the gathering of statistics. And this sort of dates all the way back to the earliest federal involvement in K-12 education was really centered around that. So I think a more interesting conversation to be having is less sort of what would happen if the department is eliminated, or will the department be eliminated, and more what's going to happen in each of those four areas, and what can we tell so far based on what we're seeing in the early signs of a new administration about how they're thinking about those discrete responsibilities.
That's great. I'm going to ask you those questions.
Yeah.
So that's great. Okay, Aaliyah, I'm going to turn to you next. So you did a terrific job of sort of explaining what social emotional skills look like and why they're important. Do we know how students are doing on those skills? We don't test for that, but do we have a sense of kind of beyond their academic performance, like how are kids doing?
So I'll answer that question in two parts as well. One, if you look at primarily K-12 report cards, there are the academic indicators, but then there's also other indicators, typically on the left side of the report card, that can be called citizenship skills or life skills or classroom skills. And those skills can range from works cooperatively with others, shows respect for their self and their classmates. Another one is display organizations. So those skills, there are skills that are measured across schools, and there are measurement tools also that look at how kids are doing. So yes, but the data that I would point to more as far as how our kids are doing, I want to pick up with the comment that Tom made, and then I have some other data points that I think are important. Tom, you talked about our chronic absenteeism rate, and I want to put a percentage and a number to that. Right now, for this last school year, was 19% of America's children were absent. That's 9.4 million kids of the 50 million kids in the U.S. public education system. So when you have 10 million kids who are just not showing up at school, we have to ask ourselves why. We have to ask ourselves, what is creating the disengagement that kids are so checked out that they're not showing up at school? So that's one key indicator that our kids are not okay. And that does not mean shoving more math, shoving more reading, more down their throats. That means we really have to take a step back and say, our kids aren't connecting here, and ask ourselves why. Also, the CDC put out a report, and 40% of young people say they are experiencing persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. 29% report having poor mental health, and only 55% of our young people say they feel close to a person at school. One. Want to ask you a question. Can you take a moment and reflect on your favorite teacher and the class that you performed best in? I can guarantee you that teacher you had a strong relationship with, you felt a connection to the content, you had strong relationships possibly with your peers, and so that environment produced something that made you want to perform well. We have to ask ourselves, what are the classroom learning environments like for kids? And remember, our kids during the pandemic had a chance to experience learning in other and alternative settings. So now to expect kids to go back to a learning setting where they're sitting in a chair or staring at a screen for 6, 7, 8 hours a day, it's not exactly conducive to the learning environment. So fundamentally, we need to be talking about transforming the learning environment to make it engaging for the next generation. And I'm saying that as a teacher and as an administrator. I also think it's important to think about OECD, which they study internationally, talked about the number of 10 to 15-year-olds who start to lose optimism in school because of the classroom environment. So when you look at those data sets, coupled with the academic scores, that is where we as adults need to take a step back and say, how can we create learning environments and the learning outcomes that we need for our young people? So it's a combination of two. Again, I don't think you can just bifurcate and look at those SEL skills.
Yeah. Tom, go ahead.
So I agree with Aaliyah on the importance of drawing students back into school. But I'm fearful that we're just admiring the problem or thinking, oh, this is a problem that we're going to, for teachers only to solve or for principals only to solve. Absenteeism is one of the very few things that organizations outside of schools could be helping with right now. Like, so most mayors can't teach Algebra 1. Actually, we've got a former mayor here.
He definitely could not teach Algebra 1,
so,
I can promise you that, yeah.
But mayors can help with public information campaigns, solving transportation issues. Employers could, create more flexibility around school pickup and drop-off times. The many museums and other organizations around Boston and elsewhere could be running, supporting extracurricular activities at schools to help draw students in. Parents could be volunteering, to show up at the school building in the morning to welcome kids to school, to help create more of that connection. So we have to close, we can't stand back and just say, oh my goodness, public schools are not solving this problem too. We need to be saying, okay, what can we be doing to help solve this? Because this is one of the barriers to students catching up.
Can I just piggyback real quick?
Please.
I absolutely agree, Tom. And in our framework, which is the most widely used SEL framework in the world, outlines the importance of three things, not just the classroom teacher and classroom environment, that's one, but parents, families, and caregivers, and then communities and schools, because really you need all three working in tandem in order to have successful outcomes for life and in school. I also think just on the parent piece as well, I'm often asked by parents, well, aren't these skills that should be taught at home? Why are you spending time with it and, spending time on these skills? What's the parent's right here? And I will say, as a parent, absolutely. All parents are the first teachers for kids. So it's that partnership between home and school. The only difference is in school, that's where kids can practice these skills in organic environments because they're in social settings with their same age peers or similar age peers. But I agree, Tom, it has to be all hands on deck.
Well, we all have a vested interest in kids doing well, and I think sometimes that gets lost, right? Like, we are talking about the future workforce, our future teachers and police officers and lawyers and doctors, and so it is in all of our best interests to make sure that they are learning the full range of skills that we've talked about. All right, I'm gonna go totally out of order. I wanna pick up actually on something you just said, Aaliyah, about sort of this question around like what the government's responsibility is, what parents' responsibility is, and I think one of the things that we've heard a lot of in the framing around education in the new administration is this idea of parents' rights. There was an executive order at the end of January that said, it is the policy of my administration, this is President Trump, to support parents in choosing and directing the upbringing and education of their children. And Kellyanne Conway was here in the forum a couple months ago and said that she thought one of the reasons that Trump won the election was because in certain states, parents were really mad that they felt like choices had been taken away from them, particularly during COVID. So my question, I'll turn to you first, Marty, but I would welcome any of you, kind of like, what are the implications of this framing of like parents' rights and this question of the role of government, like for schools and students, but also politically for how these conversations get framed and what happens?
So I think it has been a politically potent framing, actually, and that a lot of governors at the state level in Republican states have actually found success. And one of the things we've seen over the past several years is a pretty rapid expansion in policies designed to facilitate access to private education. Traditionally we had thought of these as voucher programs. Now, more commonly, they are designed as education savings account programs. So something that will allow a family not just to pay tuition expenses, but actually to assemble a range of education-related services to sort of support their child's education. Many of these programs are offered on a near or fully universal basis, so no longer means tested. And so I think this is sort of where that rhetoric points. And so I think the interesting question now is, does the Trump administration try to encourage more of that activity? It's almost certain that they'll use the bully pulpit to sort of cheer on the cause of school choice, and that's certainly what we saw under Secretary Betsy DeVos during the first administration. But I think the question is, would there be additional policy steps taken to encourage more of that kind of activity? During the first Trump administration, there was an effort a bit too late to be meaningful, but to write policy into the tax code that would allow people to receive a tax credit for donating to organizations that offer scholarships or education savings accounts to students. And this would be a way for the federal government to support financially the creation of these programs at the state level. And so it'll be interesting to see if they try to invest political capital into getting an idea like that through, and then what the reaction is. One of the things we've learned in the politics of American education in the past couple decades is that support from a president is a very mixed blessing, because all of a sudden you get about half the country excited about your idea, and the other half decides it's the worst thing ever. And that is not necessarily an improvement on the status quo for the cause of school choice, which has traditionally drawn a bit of bipartisan support.
Appreciate that.
One thing that we've seen is that schools have done a terrible job keeping parents informed during the pandemic. Like one response to this effort is to do a better job informing parents about where kids are. Since very early on, Marty's group at EdNext did a poll in the fall of 2022 where only 9% of parents reported that their child was behind and that they were concerned about whether or not they would catch up. And here it is 3 years later, and students haven't caught up. So what's the disconnect? And I think schools could be doing a better job making sure parents know that their child is below grade level in math or reading. I think it's actually related to a lot of these issues. So if I think everything is fine, I'm not signing up for summer learning.
Right.
If I think everything is fine, I'm not as concerned as I should be about student absenteeism. If I think everything is fine, I may not ask for a tutor at my school. So I think if schools did a better job keeping parents in the loop about where their children are, and not just sort of, trying to,
And several states have even gone in the opposite direction and making it worse in lowering their standards over the course of the pandemic. So, when kids have lost ground, you have sort of two options. If you want your results to look good, you help them catch up, or you lower the standards. A decent number of states have actually chosen the latter.
By the way, this is the whole point of the Education Recovery Scorecard. So before the Education Recovery Scorecard, if a state lowered its absence, there was no lowered its standards definition of proficiency, it would be impossible for parents to figure out, are students achieving above or below where they were in 2019 or 2015 or 2010? What's been the long-term trend in my district? So what we did was we used the National Assessment of Educational Progress to put all the state scores on the same scale and then report out district by district for 8,700 districts. How are they doing, not just now, but relative to where they were in 2009 and all the years in between.
If I could jump in with one quick point.
Please. And then you can go, Aaliyah.
Tom mentioned the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which we should mention. It's a federal test. It's a nationally representative testing program, the only nationally representative testing program. And that test plays the critical role of making it possible for the Education Recovery Scorecard to be in place. And so, so far, it looks like the incoming Trump administration and the DOJ team has sort of given the NATE program, as it's called, a bit of a privileged status as they have made cuts elsewhere to the research and development infrastructure. But it'll be important to sort of see if that remains in place. And it shows you, it's only the federal government that can play that role of serving as an auditor of the results that states are providing to families.
So Aaliyah, and then I want to follow up on that and actually get into what are the cuts that have been made and what are the implications of those? But Aaliyah, please.
So I think when we talk about parents' rights, we need to be talking and asking ourselves, are we really asking all parents? And Are we listening to the loudest that have the most access, affluence, and the microphone, or are we really talking to all parents regardless of platform ability? And because I'm not here to share my opinion, I like to share the facts and data. I want to just read some other data points about parents. 93% of parents, this is SEL specifically, 93% of parents say at least somewhat that SEL is somewhat important to them, to their children's school, and for it to be taught in schools, including about 2/3 of K-12 parents, which is about 66%, who say it's extremely or very important to them. Then, when we talk about educators, 80% of educators say that they place some or a lot of emphasis on social emotional learning, and 83% say it has a positive impact on student academic performance. So when we talk about what parents are saying, I think what is happening is there is a small group, and not to say that their perspective is not important, because we're talking about all parents, but I think we need to be looking at the numbers in aggregate and not just in particular groups. And so firmly believe, one, parents have a right. As a parent, I absolutely want a right and voice and more information, as I have a parent-teacher conference on Monday.
Ask them if your child's at grade level. I'm sure they are.
Yes. But it is important to make sure that we are being inclusive of all parents across the board and hearing their voices as well.
Yeah, I feel like I have to say at this point, there's also a lot of discussion and data. Parents are really overwhelmed right now. So I don't know how many parents we have on the stage and in the audience, but they're totally underwater, and they're kind of, I think that's at play here, right? Like that's part of the picture.
But Tassie, that's where we can get to common ground, because as I have had the great fortune of working across both sides of the aisle. I have traveled to 48 of the 50 states. And whether it is that parent in North Dakota living on a farm who farms corn, to a urban parent in Miami, to a parent in Houston, to Seattle, to Boise, Idaho, to Billings, Montana. When you ask them what they want for their kids, they want their kids to be successful. They want their kids to be healthy. They want their kids to have friends in school. So at the end of the day, it actually serves us better to get to the common ground of what the outcomes are for our kids, and then recognize that there's not one prescriptive way to get there, and determine what those pathways are, and the community supports and the parental supports in order to get there. But this should be the issue of any other that remains bipartisan on behalf of our kids.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
All right, so Tom and Marty, I want to turn to both of you, although Aaliyah, you also can weigh in. Can you, Tom, I know you're talking to lots of states, right, and doing work around states. So I want to sort of ask both sides of the question. One is, there are already cuts that have been made. What are the implications? What does this mean? What does it look like on the ground? And then I'm hoping at some point you can inject something hopeful and pick up on some of kind of what you were sharing in all the variation at the state level. There are some positive stories. So I would love to hear those at some point before, and then I'm going to open it up for questions in a minute. So actually, if you want to line up behind one of those two mics, I will invite your questions in just a second. But yeah.
So as Marty said, the federal contribution for K-12 budgets is just 8 to 10% nationally. And so the bigger question is, what are states doing to continue the recovery? And we ought to be embarrassed that we're in a state that is doing so little to help higher poverty districts around the state catch up. In fact, it's not even part of the debate. What are we doing to help Lynn? Lynn has fallen behind by 2 great equivalents. Lexington, Newton, Wellesley are going to be fine. What are we doing in the gateway communities? And so what gives me hope is that I do think, even though it has not started here in Massachusetts, there are a number of other states where we are starting to see leadership at the state level. The one state that is back above 2019 levels in math and that has actually done a pretty good job of closing achievement gaps? Alabama. Louisiana is the only state that's back above their 2019 levels of achievement in reading. And so there are a number of interventions that states are taking leadership on now. We don't know, I'm sure not all of them are working, but what I'm excited about is just to recognize that we need to encourage state leadership in education. We've got to identify the state efforts that are working, help states spread those. It's going to require a cross-state effort to do it. Individual states are not going to be able to figure it out on their own. And I don't think we can expect the federal government to help with that. So we're going to have to find ways to learn these lessons over the next few years and help spread them. Like and maybe at some point, our leadership here in this state will do something in K-12 education.
So all of you who are voters in Massachusetts, you should listen to that. So Marty, I want to ask you to weigh in. Like, clearly, one of the implications is states are going to have to figure this out. What else?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to look at the sort of early signs that we've seen from the incoming administration, some of the decisions that have already been made. The very first significant change we saw at the Department of Education was when the DOGE team came in and canceled what they said was about $800 million dollars of federal research grants. And so this was a little bit, contracts rather, I should say, contracts, which have a different legal status than grants, which is why that's important to get right. But it was a little surprising because, as I said, the research and development function of the federal government has sort of long been a bipartisan sort of point of agreement, a cornerstone of the federal role. I think really they went after that funding not because they questioned that priority, but more because it was something that they could legally cut. And you know, some of those cuts threaten very important data collection activities that efforts like the National Assessment of Educational Progress depend on in order to be able to function. And so that is certainly concerning. I'm sure a very charitable interpretation of what they're doing is that it's a form of almost zero-based budgeting, like sort of they're sort of canceling and want to start with a blank slate and sort of proceed with only the essential contracts negotiated on more favorable terms to the federal government. But it'll be important to see what the long-term consequences for the R&D infrastructure of the federal government are. When it comes to the program funds, Secretary Nominee McMahon, in her confirmation hearing, said, look, I and the president aren't interested in zeroing out Title I and IDEA. We're interested in making those programs more efficient. And so, there's been no sign that those major funding streams will be threatened, though, anything can happen these days. And then, I said the other main function is the Office for Civil Rights. And actually what we've seen from the Trump administration so far is a expanded vision of the mandate of that office. On February 14th, we saw a Dear Colleague letter come out from the acting Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the department, sort of extending the logic of the Students for Fair Admission decision in 2023 to a much broader set of decisions beyond admissions decisions to apply even to race-neutral distinctions, even if they were as long as they were adopted in order to pursue a goal of racial diversity. And then
even in part.
Yeah, in part. And then extending it to questions of curriculum as well. And it's that last one that is most, striking in historical perspective, because interfering with local curricular decisions has really from the outset been viewed as far beyond the federal government's legitimate authority. Prohibition on interference with local curricula is written into every federal law related to K-12 education. And so what we're actually seeing from a department that, an administration that's talking about eliminating the department is actually something that would be a quite dramatic extension of federal authority into new domain.
Okay, it's quite the picture. Thank you. All right, so I want to open up. So sorry, it's super hard to see with the lights, but I welcome, if you would like to share your name, please do, but open for questions. I'm going to go back and forth.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you so much for having this panel, this forum tonight. I'm Shaniqua Moore. I'm MC MPA student at the Kennedy School, and this conversation resonates so much with me in so many ways. I run a social enterprise in New York City that actually works with New York City School District, building out social emotional learning programs and mental health programs for students. And I'm deeply concerned about the $2.2 billion budget cut in New York City schools, which is how much of federal funding would hit New York City. In K-12, New York City schools receive $15.6 billion. So that $2.2 billion is a huge cut to the budget. And just to provide like more understanding and context, that funding does support a lot of the core programs that kids depend on to feel safe, like counseling, like nutrition programs, summer programs, after-school programs that are so necessary to their well-being. And so I'm wondering, as someone that works in schools, we work with 30 school sites building these programs. What do we do to prepare these schools for this like cut? And then, so I'm thinking on that side, but also as a future policymaker, what can cities and states do? How do we reimagine at this crossroads? What does education look like now? And creative ways with our budget to sort of figure out what to do with this huge cut that's going to hit our schools.
So the $2.2 billion that you're talking about, that's the federal funding that New York City currently receives. So as I just said, I don't want to predict anything, but I've seen zero signs so far that even the incoming administration in the department, much less members of Congress who are responsible for the power of the purse, are actually interested in changes to the federal title programs in the short run. Even the proposal in Project 2025, which was unique, by the way, from the beginning in the criticisms of the department, proposals to eliminate the department are often made by people who are simultaneously voting for continuing federal spending. So this distinction between the two is not anything new. The Project 2025 proposal did propose to phase out Title I, but only over a 10-year period. And so I certainly think it is wise for systems to be thinking about how they would respond to a major change in federal funding. But I don't think it's something that is looming on the horizon right now. And one of the ways they might want to respond is by thinking about advocacy at the state level. So really the consequences of cuts to federal funding would depend on how states respond, and in particular whether they're willing to step up and close gaps that would be largest in the districts that serve the most disadvantaged students.
And in the meantime, this 10-year phase out under the Project 2025 plan, they would convert it during that period to a block grant, which is another possibility. But that would be, in that circumstance, the New York Department of Education would be presumably allocating those dollars in the meantime. In fact, I wonder whether there is sort of a bipartisan solution here where if we reduced some of the strings, but just had fewer better strings on the Title I funding, whether that could turn out to be a better alternative than either the current Title I or the extreme version of block grants, like some place in between. Maybe there's a middle ground.
Fewer, better strings sounds like one of the things that you might actually be able to get bipartisan support for. Okay, who is up first on this side?
So, Wilfredo Gomez, master's candidate at the Graduate School of Education. So one of the things that I find really provocative about scholars doing work in higher ed is that they're really good at illuminating some of these distinctions between discourses on equality of opportunity, as opposed to discourses of equality of conditions and equality of outcomes. Given this theme of education at a crossroads, I wonder if you could sort of expound on what does that look like, or what is the thinking around some of these conversations for the current administration?
I'll take a crack at it, and I'm not sure how well I'll do, but that's what, professors will talk about anything. So, from the beginning, the centerpiece of the federal government's role in education, from the initial passage of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965, the cornerstone of that was Title I, which is additional funds for economically disadvantaged students. And the idea was that what was needed in order to give them greater equality of opportunity was additional resources that districts didn't often have the capacity to provide. And I think that basic model is at the cornerstone of federal policy. Over time, I think people started to question the assumption whether spending on its own was enough to guarantee equality of opportunity, and that's when you saw a shift towards trying to use the Title I dollars to require states to put into place testing requirements and other provisions that were meant to make sure that they use those dollars well, and that those dollars actually translate not just into improved opportunity, but improved results for the students who are the intended beneficiaries of those funds. And I guess the question is, to what extent will this new administration sort of remain committed to that basic model that has evolved over time, or really try to blow it up or shift it in a fundamentally different direction? The early appointees to the secretary's team, again, they await confirmation, but people like Penny Schwinn, who was the Commissioner of Education in Tennessee, Kirsten Baszler, who was in the same position in North Dakota, these were leaders at the state level who were actually pretty committed to the cause of test-based accountability, measuring results as a means of trying to ensure that that we're getting not just equal opportunity as defined by resources, but different results. And it'll be interesting to see how their sort of views evolve and how they answer the question, what's the federal role in that? So
I would love to respond, but I'll go in I think, a slightly different way. So, Tom, you mentioned at the top that our kids who were most at risk are now 2 to 3 years behind.
In some districts, not everyone.
Not everyone, but a lot of them. And my concern is the fundamental role that the U.S. Department of Education has is to serve those children most at risk. Low income, rural, children with disabilities. As a special ed teacher, this one hits hard because it's not just kids with IEPs, but also 504 plans, like the umbrella of students with special needs. And I'm concerned about what the destabilization of the U.S. Department of Education will do to all of the kids who fall in that umbrella. As a person who was a principal in rural Tucson, I think about what would have happened if we would have lost a significant amount of federal funding to support our kids. I think about, as a special ed teacher, those resources that you know you need just to give your kids a chance. So part of what brought me here today is I actually am an introvert and prefer to be behind the scenes. But I think now is a time for multiple voices to be heard, because we are at a crossroads, and there are 50 million kids in the United States who are depending on us to use our best thinking, our best intentions for their outcomes. And so I think that's why these conversations are so critically important, because there's a dominant voice at the microphone right now, and I think we need to open it up to more perspectives, and those that particularly have had a hands-on view in education, because it's gonna matter. So
So Tassie, you reminded us this is the Institute of Politics. And one of the things that has happened over the last 30 years is politicians have decided not to invest their political capital in education and in trying to close these gaps. And that's ironic because between 1990 and 2015, we actually were doing, we had made a lot of progress. The improvements in 4th grade and 8th grade math, we don't tell this story very well. In some states, like North Carolina, the improvement in 8th grade math achievement was equal to like a whole standard deviation. Like that was bigger than the black-white achievement gap was in 1990. They moved the whole state by that amount. And there were a number of other states, including our own, that had made a lot of progress between 1990 and 2015. Race achievement gaps in 4th and 8th grade math were declining through 2015. They've started to grow again. So I think if we remind people that these are not intractable problems, these are issues that we can make progress on, we have made progress on. A part of it is test-based accountability. That, the ironic thing is, up through 2015, there was a coalition of moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans. Senator Kennedy here in Massachusetts was one of the co-sponsors of the No Child Left Behind Act. That there used to be a bipartisan agreement on the importance of test-based accountability. I think part of what we're seeing now is that fell apart. Achievement gaps are widening again. And we've not, somehow we need to pull that back together, and maybe it's at the state level. It's going to be a while before it happens at the federal level.
Yeah. Thanks. Please.
Thank you so much. I really have enjoyed listening to all of you. And my name is Nina Nadribo. I am with the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'm pursuing a master's in education policy. So my question is with regard to the impact of the executive order under the Trump administration of the rescission of protected area policies for immigration enforcement. Aaliyah Samuel, you mentioned that the current absentee rate is at 20%, but could that number be different now that that order is in place? And I've learned from a teacher in, for example, Chelsea, Massachusetts, which you mentioned gateway cities. That is the gateway city which receives more refugees and immigrants, but there has been an increase in absenteeism because many of the students may be scared to come to school, maybe from other countries, do not have potentially papers. So what is the impact of that order on absenteeism, or what might be in the future, and then what can be done to address it?
Yeah, so great question. Again, I don't come outside often, but when I do, I try to go to diverse places. I actually attended a meeting at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, which is a conservative think tank out of DC, that did a really incredible report on the data unpacking chronic absenteeism. And I would encourage you to look up the report online. And they looked at, I don't remember how many years, but the interesting thing about the chronic absenteeism data is that it impacts every single community and socioeconomic status. So it's not just immigrant children, it's not just poor, it's rich, white, black, Hispanic. This chronic absenteeism issue is one that is touching all of us. And Tom, you brought up a really good point of, like, there was a time where, the phrase, it's a terrible phrase, but there's a sausage making to policy making. You get in a room, you hammer it out, and you come out with the best outcome. And the things that we really need to be talking about are the math scores, are the literacy scores, and what we need to do to raise them collectively. But the chronic absenteeism alarm is ringing in every single community. And I wish I knew. Truly, this is a time I wish I had a crystal ball to tell you what the impacts of some of these executive orders are and will be. I was mentioning in the green room that I'm giving it 6 months. I really would like to see 6 months from now where we are, and to then have a recalibration of the conversation, because things are so rapidly moving that I just don't know. But this one impacts every single community.
Thanks. All right, I think it's 7, so I'm going to give you the last question.
I'll close us out.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for this conversation. My name is Malaika Agukwe. I am also a master's candidate over at the Ed School. And so something that I'm taking away from this conversation is, right, the need to spread the burden across communities to really support our kids. And Dr. Samuel, this question is kind of directed towards you. So one of the CASEL focus areas is adult SEL, and we've kind of on this conversation, we've talked about how parents, adults are really spread thin. So my question is, like, how can we support adult SEL so that the adults and parents, community members that are taking care of our kids are also kind of being taken care of as well?
Thank you for the question. And actually, 2 years ago, our conference theme was adult SEL, because there's a real recognition. And right now, what we're seeing is every level of the community is stressed. Parents are stressed, teachers are stressed, administrators are stressed, superintendents are stressed, which is why they're not staying 2 to 3 years. Like, there's stress at every level of the system. And again, another horrible analogy that I'm going to use, but it's one that as an educator, I believe that if you don't feed the teachers, they devour the children. And so we have to be thinking about adult wellness. We have to be thinking about these supports, which is why professional development for adult SEL is so important, so that teachers, classroom, I don't even want to say teachers, school personnel, because it is the crossing guard, it's the office manager, it's the school nurse, it's the principal, it's the parents, to be able to understand the amount of stress that we're under. And how that plays out, and giving the adults, particularly the adults that are modeling the behaviors that we want our students to have the vocabulary to be able to facilitate some of these dialogues, to be able to then also broker the skills that we want to see, like perspective taking, like civil discourse, should I say. We have to be able to model that, because kids don't do what you say, they do what they see. And so we need to be talking about that. We have a whole vein around adult SEL that we are working on as well, because it is a very real thing. And then too, Tassie, to your point, there's been a lot of attention paid here lately. There was a great Wall Street Journal article as well about just the stress that parents are under. And in addition to the executive order that the young woman over here somewhere mentioned, I also worry about childcare availability and what that's going to do to the stress of parents. So, I mean, there's going to be a lot of levels to this. Also, I think about the kids who are living in homes where a parent has been laid off or a caregiver has been laid off, and what that stress will then do. And then they're going to school. So we've got to think about how to have the conversations, because a kid who's worrying about what to eat or if their parents are going to have a job to pay the bills can't sit down and focus on math. So we've got to talk about adult well-being and the ripple effects as well.
I really appreciate the question. I think that's a nice note to kind of end us on. We have to really think about the full environment surrounding kids and their caregivers and their schools and their communities. And we all have a really vested interest in making sure that those are created to help children thrive. So please join me in thanking our panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Tassie.